panelists at the table, please? Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, so we have a really exciting and interesting event planned out, and I'm really honored to have such an amazing speakers and panelists here with us. Before we start, I just want to take a little bit of time to acknowledge and think about the fact that we are having this event on land that is unceded and colonized and stolen, and the stewards of this land never agreed to have it taken from them, just as...
It's just your direction.
Okay, thank you. Just as we are passionate about the rights of Palestinians and vocal about how unjustly their homeland has been taken from them, we need to acknowledge our presence on these stolen, unceded territories. This is the ancestral, traditional homeland of the Coast Salish First Nations people who have lived here for thousands of years. Those of us who are not Coast Salish are uninvited guests here, and throughout the evening, let's keep that, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah? All right. Yeah, so although we are struggling to make a place for ourselves on this land, we should be grateful to the stewards of this land and ensure that the way we behave and act on this land is respectful and we do not do anything to injure it. I also hope that we will take more of an initiative, myself included, to learn more about the traditions of the keepers of this land and their struggle to maintain and take care of their home. I also want to note that this is a non-partisan event. The aim is to get ourselves properly equipped as the election sort of looms closer. We're not here to push you to vote a specific way, but I do hope you feel more comfortable in engaging with the politics of this country, and I'm really excited about the conversations we'll be having and the dialogue that I hope this event opens up. So just to sort of introduce the panelists we have here. Thank you. Hasan Alam is a lawyer, a Vancouver-based activist, human rights activist, and he's a lawyer at the Canadian Union of Public Employers, and a founding member of Critical Muslim Voices, which is an advocacy group for Muslims and provides an alternative voice. And Itrath Syed is a PhD candidate in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. Itrath is a social justice activist involved with the local anti-war movement, in anti-occupation solidarity work, and in resisting the erosion of civil rights and the racial profiling of Muslims, Arab, and South Asian communities in Canada. And Sheikh Murtaza Bachoo, we all know him pretty well, but he is the religious consultant at Al Mustafa Academy Society in the Zahra Islamic Center. He is the graduate of the University of British Columbia in Chemical Engineering. He completed his seminary studies in Qom, Iran. Did I get that right? Electrical. All right. I will have Hasan Alam speak first.
Great. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Just this here. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I also want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here today on the occupied territories of the Coast Salish people, the Burrard, the Musqueam, Squalatoot, and Squamish. I feel very happy to be here in this space, and thank you for having me. I want to start off by just, again, as Zara pointed out, talking a little bit about why I started off by acknowledging these territories that we're here on. I think it's a very important thing for us as a community to start doing at our gatherings for multiple reasons. As Zara pointed out, we're all guests on this land here. We've come from other lands and we've migrated to Canada for multiple reasons. Many of us have come here because our own lands and homelands have been occupied by foreigners. And so we're coming here as guests. And sometimes when we come here as guests and sometimes when we settle here, we forget about the fact that this land right here that we've settled upon was also taken away from a community, from a people. And that this community and this people, namely the Aboriginal or Indigenous people, continue to struggle to take back this land. And they're doing it in a very hospitable way. They're not trying to kick us off this land, but they just want to have the rightful stewards that they are, to have that stewardship restored. So as a community, we are very vocal about speaking out against the occupation of our own lands, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Palestine, whether it's what's happening in Kashmir, wherever, and that's very important for us to do, but I think it's important for us to start integrating as a part of that dialogue, also to start speaking out against the occupation of the indigenous people's lands, namely Canada as well. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to start by acknowledging that. Now I've been asked to come here and speak about, I guess, the issues that are facing Muslims right now in Canada, particularly in the context of the elections. And I have to say, it's a bit of a daunting task to speak about that in 10 to 15 minutes, because there's just so many issues facing us right now as a community in Canada. I have to say, I think it is a very interesting and somewhat scary time for us as Muslims living in Canada. The level of Islamophobia, or the fear and prejudice against Muslims right now is at an all-time high. It almost feels like it's 9/11 all over again in terms of just the atmosphere that's there. So I guess for my talk, I do broadly want to focus on the issue of Islamophobia, because I think a lot of the issues and policies and laws and really the campaign points that are coming up in these elections do revolve around Islamophobia and do revolve around Muslims, and these are all things that are very relevant to us. Now, whether or not these are real issues or just political speaking points is something that I want to question, but the fact of the matter is, the reality is that the candidates that we're dealing with, the political parties that we're dealing with, are in fact talking about Islamophobia, or at least propagating Islamophobia in a lot of ways. And I think Islamophobia is an issue for us as Muslims, not only because of the policies that are being passed by the government, but also because when you look at the impact which this is having in everyday life, it's very real. We're seeing an increased amount of violence against Muslims right now as a result of this rhetoric that's coming mainly from the conservative government. And I know Zara started off by saying that this is a non-partisan event, but let me be clear as I start by talking that I am by far partisan. I am partisan against the conservative government, and I can't give this talk without actually not, I guess, speaking in this manner. I think it's very evidently clear that for us as a community, the conservative government is not a good choice. So if it's not going to become clear from my talk as I go along, I'll say it now that I am going to be speaking out overwhelmingly against the conservative government and their policies, but I will also acknowledge as I go along, or try to acknowledge what the other parties are also saying about these issues. In fact, right now, and this is a stat that I was going to say, 44% of all the hate crimes that are happening in Canada are against people who identify as Muslim. Now that's 44% of the people who are actually Muslim. There's about another 20 to 25% who are also being targeted, and they're mostly people of South Asian background, and they're being targeted because people who are targeting them think that they're Muslim. So those are Sikh people mostly. So that's just how high the amount of, Islamophobia or hatred towards Muslims right now is, and I think that's directly linked to the sort of Islamophobia that's being talked about by the government. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge before I go into this that when we talk about Islamophobia, what Islamophobia really means, or what the definition of Islamophobia is that it is a prejudice or hatred towards the religion of Islam and Muslims. That's what I mean when I use the term Islamophobia. And like I said, we've seen a very significant increase in hate crimes and sort of fear-mongering against Muslims in recent times. But this sort of Islamophobia goes back before the conservative government. It goes back prior to 9/11. And in fact, Islamophobia itself is part of, or falls under the umbrella of what we call racism, right? It falls under prejudice. And Canada as a country has a long history of this sort of racism against people, not just Muslim, but pretty much anyone who's an ethnic minority. has faced this at the hands of the Canadian government. If we go back to the founding of the Canadian state, it was the Indigenous people who faced this sort of targeting by the Canadian government. And a lot of the same language that we now see being used against Muslims, such as, oh, Muslims are savages, Muslims' practices are barbaric, they don't treat their women equally, all this stuff. Those are the same things that were said against Indigenous people when this country was created. If we go forward, when we look at Chinese and Japanese migrants, the same sort of language was used against them. We go to even further forward. We look at the Sikh Canadians who came here on the Kamagata Maru in the 1900s. They too were labeled as being savages and barbaric, and even the word terrorist was thrown around. And if you go into the 1980s, you see that there was a debate happening then around whether Sikhs should be allowed to wear the turban or not, right? Which is very similar to the debate that's happening right now around the niqab and the hijab. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is, number one, it's important to acknowledge this because it as a community, it makes us realize that this isn't just about us, right? This isn't just about our cultural practices. This isn't just about our religion. There's not something particular about Islam and Muslims that makes us a target. It's what the Canadian government and other governments around the world do. They target ethnic minorities. It is a way to, number one, mobilize, get people out to support their policies, because by using this fear of another community, the government can mobilize people to come out and vote and support the policies that they put out there. I think also another very strategic sort of use that we're seeing by the Conservatives in terms of this sort of Islamophobia is that it instills fear in us as a community to not be politically active. It keeps us from coming out there and speaking out against the government's policies. It keeps us from going out there and voting. Because if you're dealing with a government that's always telling you, oh, you don't belong here, oh, your cultural practices are barbaric and backwards, I think you'd be less motivated to go out there and vote because you just feel like you don't belong. And that's what we've seen traditionally, what this government has done against Chinese people, against Sikh people, against Japanese people, against Indigenous people, and this is just a cycle that's being repeated here. And I think thirdly, why this is really important to acknowledge is because then it also, as us for a community, it gives us a way to build bridges and ties with these other communities that are also facing this oppression. So we can come together and speak out against this oppression as a whole. And I think that's something that we as a community need to do more, which is to stretch out our hand and build these ties with these other communities so we can be stronger, not just by ourselves, but together as a whole. So I thought it was really important to acknowledge that. Now, transitioning to the topic at hand, what are the issues that are important to Muslims, that are facing Muslims right now? I mean, there's so many right now, like I said, but I think what we're really seeing at the forefront of the debate right now in these elections is the niqab, right? Like you keep hearing about this over and over again from all the parties right now, but really the Conservative government is the one that's putting this out there the most, is that we need to ban the niqab. And just a little bit of history around this, the niqab or the face veil, this debate really came to the forefront of politics in December of 2011 when the Citizenship and Immigration Minister, Jason Kenney, announced a policy directive that was targeted at making Muslim women remove the niqab or their face veil when they went to give the citizenship oath. Now the citizenship oath is the oath that you give when you become a citizen of Canada and you go before a judge and you declare your allegiance to Canada. And what the Conservative government at the time was saying, that Muslim women need to remove their veil at that moment when they do that. Now, really, when you look at the niqab debate itself, like the Conservatives tried to pass a law to enforce this. It went through, but then the federal courts of Canada actually struck down this law and said that it was unconstitutional. Now here we are again in the elections, and the Conservative government has picked up this issue again and tried to make it into an election issue. And they're pushing now, Harper himself has said that if he comes into power, he will push a law or put a law forward, whereas when anyone who works in the public sector, whether it's for the government, whether wherever you are, you won't be able to wear the niqab. So he's making this into an election issue again. But when we actually look at the niqab as an issue, what we see is that statistics show that a very, very small minority of Muslim women actually wear the niqab in Canada. It's so marginal, it's not even real. Further, most of these women are actually willing to remove their face veil when they go to vote and when they go to give the citizenship oath. Because the real issue at hand here, which the Conservative government is saying, is that, oh, we can't identify these women when they go and get their driver's license or when they go and take their oath. But these women are saying, what these women are saying is that as long as there's another woman there, I'm willing to take off my veil and have myself identified. So it really isn't that big of an issue. And for us as a community, it really isn't that big of an issue either, because there's such a small minimum amount of women that wear this veil. But what kind of makes it an issue for us though as a community though is the fact that the language that we see being used around the niqab is very, very, and the language that's being used to ban the niqab is very Islamophobic. It's very, it's charged with racism. What the Harper government is saying is that we need to save Muslim women from Muslim men, that these Muslim women are being forced to wear the niqab. And what's scary about this is that right now it's the niqab, but it could, in the future, very foreseeably stretch to the hijab, right? Where the language around the niqab and the hijab is very blurred when they speak about it. They don't really differentiate all the time between the niqab and the hijab. So right now it might be the niqab, and I've heard a lot of Muslims say, well, why should we care about the niqab? I don't believe in the niqab either. Actually, a lot of our ulama say that Muslim women don't have to wear the niqab, so why should we even speak out against the niqab? Well, the fact is that right now it's the niqab, but tomorrow it could very, very easily be the hijab. So for that reason, we need to come out and say that no government can tell any woman, actually, not just Muslim women, but women in general, given that we live in a liberal democratic society, how they should or shouldn't dress. That's not the role of government. That's the right of every woman living in Canada to decide whether how she wishes to dress. So that in a very short blimp is what the niqab issue is about right now in Canada. Now, I guess you're wondering, like, why though is the government going on about the niqab? I think the Conservative government is using the niqab very strategically to take away our attention from the real issues that are at hand in these elections, right? The government isn't talking about the economy and the fact that right now Canadian oil prices are falling at an all-time low, and this Conservative government, because over the past decade of its power, it's made the economy so dependent on oil, our economy is crashing right now, and they're trying to divert the attention away from this issue. This government isn't talking about climate change. It's not talking about the fact that the Conservative government has not only failed to acknowledge that climate change is an issue, but it's made every effort to actually take away or deregulate policies that are aimed at regulating carbon emissions, that are aimed at making Canada more green. And this really is an issue for the Muslim community, climate change, right? It's an issue for everybody, but why is it an issue for us? Because our kids are gonna have to live in this world. Our grandchildren are gonna have to live in this world. And the way things are going right now, they might not have a world where the climate is that livable. That's a fact, that's a statistic. And Canada is actually one of the nations in the world that is really lagging behind in their climate policies around this, mainly due to the Conservative government. The NDP is, of course, a lot better about this policy. They've pledged to put out stronger regulations around carbon emissions. They've pledged to revisit the Kyoto Protocol. The Liberals are not as good as the NDP, but they're still much better than the Conservative government. So if you're concerned about climate change, the Conservatives aren't there. We're not talking about foreign policy either. The niqab is a big distraction from the foreign policy of the Conservative government right now. Right now, Canada is more involved in the Middle East than it ever has been. We've sent troops to support in Syria. We've sent troops into Iraq. We've started bombing in Syria, and we've sent our support to Iraq. So we're very much involved in the Middle East, and the Conservative government is trying to take away attention from this, because what polls show is that Canadians are actually opposed to Canada being involved in the Middle East right now. And it's up to you. I'll leave it up to you what your opinion is on intervention in the Middle East. But as we've seen from the past, any foreign intervention in the Middle East is bad intervention. It leads to instability. Immigration policy underneath the conservative government is also something which is being detracted from. Now, I'm going to go more into these different, I guess, issues a little bit more in depth, but what I want to end by saying in terms of the niqab is that we as a community should also not get caught up with this debate around whether or not the niqab should be banned or not. I think it's really important that if we are approached by the media, if we are pressed on this issue, we should stick to the point of view, which is that Muslim women have the right to wear or dress in whichever way they choose to dress, and that in a liberal democratic democracy is something that we're guaranteed. Now, going back to the real issues, I think one of the issues that we most need to be concerned about right now in the elections is what are the different parties' stances around immigration, right? Because that is something that's very real for us. Most of us came here as immigrants, right? And a lot of our family members are still trying to come here as immigrants, and many of us living in this community don't have citizenship status right now. So this is something that we really need to keep on top of in terms of which political party, what are they saying in terms of immigration laws. Now, turning to the conservative government first, the conservatives have created a two-tier immigration system, which makes it harder pretty much for people coming from certain countries. And if you look at it, if you actually look statistically at it, it's mainly people coming from Muslim countries. The conservative government has made it harder for people coming from Muslim countries to actually come to Canada. Whereas people coming from Western European countries have a much easier time. And this applies to refugees as well. So the government has actually put laws into place which make it very, very hard for refugees to come to Canada. And of course, right now, as we look at the world, the majority of refugees that are coming to Canada are refugees that come from Syria, that come from Iraq, that come from Afghanistan, that come from Somalia, that come from majority Muslim countries. So, I mean, that is an issue for us, and we need to be aware of this. The Liberals have pledged to amend a lot of the changes that the Conservative government have put into play, and so has the NDP. I think the NDP is better on the refugee and immigration policy than the Liberals, but both of the parties have actually are at least saying at the time that they will amend all the sort of changes that the government has made, the Conservative government, which has resulted in this two-tier system. I think what's most scary right now is that the Conservative government is saying that if they come into power, they will cut all healthcare to refugees. Now, they already tried to do this before. They cut all healthcare to refugees. So if you come to Canada as a refugee, then essential healthcare, well, you are only guaranteed very, very certain essential healthcare items, but a lot of other healthcare you won't have access to. And the Conservative government is saying that if they come back into power, they will reintroduce that policy. So again, it's very troubling when it comes to that. Another, I guess, item when it comes to immigration is what the different parties are saying when it comes to numbers. Right now, we're facing a crisis in terms of the Syrian refugee crisis, and so far, the Conservative government has only pledged to let in 10,000 Syrian refugees. That's on top of the 10,000 that they've already let in, so that comes out to about 20,000 migrants. Now, if you look at what other, I guess, Western developed countries have pledged, that number is very small. Very, very small in comparison. And we as a country are capable of letting in much more, many more refugees. We have the infrastructure, we have the land, right? I mean, look at Saskatchewan, look at Manitoba. I mean, not the best place to live, but sure, we have the land there, we have the infrastructure. So the Conservatives' numbers are very, very low. Both the NDP and the Liberals have pledged that if they come into power, they will increase that number to match what the other sort of Western developed countries are saying. And I think for us as Muslims, this is an issue that we need to push, especially because people from Syria, people from Iraq, people from Afghanistan are trying to come here and are facing so much oppression there. Another measure that we as Muslims need to be aware of right now, and which is a very hot topic in the elections, is something that's called Bill C-24. This is an immigration measure, and what this bill allows the government to do is basically, if you are someone living in Canada with dual citizenship, So if you are from Pakistan and you have a Pakistani citizenship and you have a Canadian citizenship, the government has the power to strip you of your Canadian citizenship and send you back to Pakistan. This is unheard of. This is something that's never been done in Canadian history, and in fact, it's in violation of international law in a lot of ways. This is something the conservative government has pushed into power. It is now something that is in law, and the conservative government has actually used this. Now, I should say that they can't just do this arbitrarily. Like, there has to be, like, so the way that they can do this is if you're ever convicted of a crime. If you're convicted of a crime, like, and in particular, what the focus is on is terrorism and espionage, then the government can do this. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, okay, why do I need to be scared? If I'm a law-abiding citizen, why should I be scared of if the government can or cannot take away my citizenship? Well, multiple reasons. Number one, again, this government, if we look at its history, always starts out with introducing one small measure. So right now they're saying, well, yeah, if you commit a crime, we can take away your citizenship. But if you open that door up, then it opens the door to them further pushing that law and being able to do it more freely and more liberally. So we need to stop this at this point. Secondly, a lot of the people who get convicted of terrorism in Canada aren't actually terrorists. There's a lot of wrongfully convicted people who are being held in detention. If I can take your memory back, even maybe about 8 years, we saw that the men held underneath security certificates in Canada. And security certificates are is this sort of legislation which allows the government to detain people indefinitely or forever without any evidence. Five Muslim men, all Muslim men were held underneath security certificates. None of them were ever convicted. So if Bill C-24 was in practice then, and if it was law, the government could have then deported these men back to wherever their dual citizenship was. So I think we have to be scared about Bill C-24, and it's something that the conservative government has pushed forward, and both the Liberals and the NDP have said that they would revoke this bill if they came into power. Now, another issue that's very relevant to us as a community is what the different parties are saying about surveillancing and policing. We as a community are probably the most heavily surveillanced, and when I mean surveillanced, I mean when the government comes and monitors you, when the government comes and wiretaps your phone, when the RCMP comes and interviews people. We as a community are one of the most heavily surveillance communities in Canada. And as of recently, I'm sure you guys have heard, the Conservatives introduced Bill C-51. Now, for those of you not familiar with Bill C-51, Bill C-51 is what's been referred to as Canada's secret police bill. This is a piece of legislation which came into power, I believe in the fall or the late summer, which allows the government to surveillance people, which means wiretapping your phone, wiretapping your mosque, to detain people, which means coming in and arresting people and taking them away to jail with very or practically no evidence against you. If they have any sort of suspicion that you're involved in anything related to terrorism, then they can come and do these sort of things to you. Bill C-51 has also introduced the no-fly list. So for the first time in Canada, formally and legally, the government can put you on a no-fly list. So if you want to go, for example, to visit your relatives in Pakistan, they could put you on a no-fly list and prevent you from getting on that plane if they suspect that you have any sort of relationship to any sort of terrorist activity. Now, I think the real scary thing about Bill C-51, and you might be sitting there again thinking, well, why do I need to be scared about this if I'm not doing anything wrong? The thing is that it opens up the door to you being under suspicion so much more. So if you are in a room with a bunch of people and somebody in that room starts talking about something related to terrorism or doing something related to terrorism, the fact that you are sitting in that room and that you heard that under Bill C-51 makes you open to being convicted of terrorism charges. That's just how open this door becomes with Bill C-51. So again, I think for us as a community who has so traditionally been targeted by surveillancing, by policing, by anti-terrorism legislations wrongfully, right? Never rightfully, wrongfully. We've been targeted and stereotyped so much, we need to be scared about this bill and we need to speak out against it. Now, Harper is the one who introduced this, so of course the Conservatives are going to push this forward and push this even further if they come into power. the Liberals and Justin Trudeau have actually, I think it's tricky to say what they've done. I guess they've endorsed it, kind of.
Well, they voted for it.
They voted for it. So they have voted in favor of this, but they have said that they would amend this bill and make it less scary if they came into power, but still, that's, in my mind, that's a pretty weak position. And the NDP itself has said that they would revoke the bill altogether or try to get rid of it if it came into power, revoke it. So that's where the three parties stand on this issue. Now, that's a very broad, I guess, overview of what the issues are for us as a community, and I think I've kind of painted a sort of really bleak picture in a lot of ways of what's happening, and my goal isn't to do that. It isn't to make you guys scared. It isn't to make you guys feel as if, you know, everything for the Muslim community in Canada is going wrong. But I think it's just to point to the urgency of what's out there and the urgency of us as a community going out and voting in this elections, because there is so much riding on the line right now for us as a community that we really need to get out there in these elections and vote. And I'm like I said, I'm not going to be pretend to be neutral. I think we need to vote the Conservatives out in these elections. I also want to say that I think when we hear a lot of this sort of rhetoric around Islamophobia, and we hear a lot about a lot of these laws, it's important for us not to, I think the first reaction that we as a community have is usually to be scared, and that's fair. And we sort of kind of regress from anything to do with the public. We get scared about talking about politics in our mosque. We get scared about talking about anything against the government because these policies and laws make us so vulnerable to being targeted. But I think as a community, when we hear about these things, it's important for us to speak out even more, to be even more vocal, and to get out there into the public sphere even more, because this is exactly what the Conservative government is trying to make us do, is to make us scared and to not go out there. Because traditionally, if you look at statistics, Muslims don't vote for the Conservatives, right? That's a fact. We as a community, as a whole, don't vote for the Conservatives. So they've recognized that, and they want to keep us away from the voting booths by talking about these sort of things. So let's get out there and do that. But let's not just get out there as a community. Let's not only talk about our issues, but let's also talk about the other issues in Canada outside of Islamophobia. Let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about the rights of Indigenous people and the fact that, you know, this government has done very, very little to address the crimes and the continuing crimes that exist against Indigenous people. This government has done nothing to address the fact that there's hundreds and hundreds of missing and murdered Aboriginal women out there still, and nothing's been done to investigate or at least do something about the fact that every year more and more women go missing. Let's get out there and politically mobilize around these issues as well. So I wanted to keep my talk short because I want to leave more room for discussion. So if you guys have any more questions about any of these particular areas, I'm more than willing to talk about that more in depth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You covered like so many pertinent and important issues. I'd like to give the mic over to Itrath.
Do I need the mic? Would you be able to hear me if I speak without the mic? Yeah? Okay.
Can you all hear at the back?
No,
Yeah.
I think you need the mic.
Oh, okay, sorry. Can I pin this on myself? Oh, sorry. That's right. Don't join it up. Okay.
You can take it out.
Hold it. No. This should be fine. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm so pleased to be here, and I want to thank Zahra for inviting me, and I'm always honored to be in this community and to be with you all. Again, I also had written down that I wanted to acknowledge the unceded land that we are on of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. I want to just emphasize that this is what was the ongoing dispossession, which is not over, but the ongoing dispossession of the First Nations people is not just of their land, but of their language and their culture. And I think these things we really understand because we fight so hard in Canada to hold on to our languages and to hold on to our beliefs and to hold on to our culture. So we must really understand how that was forcibly removed, forcibly, violently removed, and continues to be, so much so that languages are now actually disappeared from the earth. and that is our collective loss. So just to keep that in mind, and it's impossible and very unjust to have a conversation about politics in Canada without acknowledging that we are on unceded land and that our story is deeply embedded and connected to that of the Indigenous people in this land. Okay, so I don't get to do the exciting part. I'm going to do a basic elections 101 basic rundown of how the Canadian government works. And I think one of the things, aside from all of the hatred and fear that we are hearing in the media all of the time, one of the things I think that keeps us from participating is because we just don't know all of the vocabulary and all the language and understand the structure of the government, which may be different from the government in the countries that we came from or our family came from. And we don't talk about it enough in our community, so I'm so glad to be here to be able to do this here. So this is sort of targeted to the youth group, because a youth group invited me, so I'm going to sort of work it through like that. So essentially, there are 3 levels of government in Canada. So there is the federal, the provincial, and the municipal. In Canada, the way the government is structured, that the powers and the responsibilities of each that run the country are divided not equally but differently and distinctly between these 3 levels of government. At the top of this is a symbolic head called the Governor General. The Governor General is essentially without power. It's a ceremonial position now, but it is a legacy of British colonialism. So that still remains. So the federal, provincial, and municipal, the election that's coming up is a federal election. So we will be electing the parliament. The federal government consists of the Parliament, the House of Commons, and the Senate. The Parliament, which is the House of Commons, and the Senate. It consists of all of the MPs, the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet. I'm going to explain all of those positions. In a minute. The provincial government they're usually called provincial legislatures, at least in BC it's called provincial legislatures. People who get elected to the provincial legislature in BC are called MLAs. In Ontario, they're called MPPs. In Quebec, they're called MNAs. There's different forms. And they have a separate election and a separate responsibilities that are delegated to the provincial government through the Constitution. The municipal are mayors, city councillors, park board trustees, school board trustees, etc. The municipal government is independent. They run a lot of things, like sometimes the police force, like the Vancouver Police Department. They run all of the municipal things. But they are sort of under directly through the provincial government. So the federal government consists of the Senate and the House of Commons. Who's going to do this? The Senate is technically more prestigious and it's technically above, it's the highest level. However, practically it has less power than the House of Commons. The Senate consists of 105 unelected, as in appointed members, and they're appointed till the age of 75. It's called for life, but it means till they're 75. Obviously, if you've been following the news, there is a lot of scandal and controversy around the Senate. It's been in the news constantly. There are currently 27 vacant seats in the Senate, and there's a lot of discussion. Periodically, every election cycle, there's discussion about reforming the Senate, making it an elected body as it is in the US, or abolishing the Senate, because the Senate is a legacy of the British House of Lords, which is the sober house of second thought. So the idea is to abolish it, because it's a legacy of hierarchy. And the different parties, by the way, have positions on this. The Senate is appointed by the Governor General on advice of the sitting Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, so it's just technically appointed by the Governor General. Essentially, it's the Prime Minister, and the idea is since they're appointed for life, that they should be free of bias, that they should be able to act in their conscience, and they should be a freer, more sober house. That is obviously, as we know, not at all. does not happen like that. The House of Commons is what we vote for. And that is where laws are passed. That is where the actual government happens. There are, as of 2013, there are 338 seats in the House of Commons. In the previous election, there were 308 elected MPs. Now there are 338, which means that there's new ridings that are created, which is why the person who has been your MP may not even be running in your riding if you are part of a redistricting situation. So that's important to know what your riding boundaries are and who is running for each party in your riding. And you can really easily find that out by going to the elections.ca website, which is a non-partisan, just a bureaucratic thing that runs the elections. It's elections.ca. And you can put in your postal code and you can find out all of this information. So it's very important to do that. That will also give you links to their websites, the party websites, and to the candidates' websites on their party's larger website system, and you can read about them and find that out. 338 seats. So on your ballot, you will see the name of the candidates in your riding, and in brackets, their party affiliations. So it's important to know that there will be four basic parties running, the sort of main parties, and we call them main because they're running candidates in 338 ridings. That's how we generally determine a party is sort of a national party. There will be probably 3 or 4 joke candidates. You should really know, and sometimes they use names that are similar to the real candidates because they're having fun. It's not funny. So make sure you know the name of your candidate, the one that you want to support, and you're clear about that on the ballot. Okay, so there are I was going to ask for someone taller. Okay, so there are 4 basic parties that you should see on your ballots, in no particular order of moral importance. So this is, I believe, the first time or the second time that the Green Party is running a full slate, which brings them into the national consciousness. If you're in Quebec, you will have a 5th party on your ballot called the Bloc Québécois, but it won't be here. The Bloc Québécois runs federal candidates, but they run only in Quebec. And they're probably going to get more seats than they did last time. The Conservatives, Liberal, the NDP, and Green. These are the 4 major parties. The Green, I'm calling it a major party because it's running in all of the ridings. However, they only have 1 member in Parliament now, and that is their first member in Parliament, which is the leader of the party, Elizabeth May. So the Conservatives, the Liberal, the NDP, there is generally, we talk about there being a political spectrum, and parties sit on places in the political spectrum, moving from left to right. So if this is, that's not even visible, I know. Try another pen. Okay. If this is the political spectrum, this is the center, this is the left, and this is the right. So I'm going to sort of tell you the consensus. Obviously, this is debatable. This is not hard science, but people generally understand that the Canadian Conservative Party is about halfway right of center. And Canadian political spectrum is different from other political spectrums. So as in the entire Canadian political spectrum is much to the left of the US political spectrum. So the Conservatives would be here. The Liberals, the current incarnation of the Liberals, are probably just a little bit right of center. The NDP are probably here. And the Green are hard to place on the spectrum, because the Green Party originally came up in the world as particularly a single issue party around climate change and the environment, and since then they've evolved globally. They exist in many countries, and they've evolved their political platform, but they're still kind of hard to place on the spectrum, so I'm not going to actually place them. As well, if you were in Quebec, the Bloc Québécois is very hard to place. They're left-wing, but they have a lot of right-wing policies, so they're a little hard to place. Generally, what people know from the history of Canadian politics is that the Liberal Party campaigns left of center, but governs right of center. So you should always keep that in mind when you hear what they say. Okay, so one of the key things to remember about Canadian politics is that you don't vote for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's name is not on the ballot, ever. The only people on the ballot are the candidates running for MP in your riding. The way that the Prime Minister is the person who is the head of the party that has the most votes, most elected MPs in the House of Parliament. And that's how we get a Prime Minister. But unlike in other countries, and this is often confusing, especially for young kids in Canada, when we're growing up and we watch a lot of Canadian television, but we also watch a lot of American television and American both shows, TV shows that talk about American politics or American news. It's very confusing. In America, you vote for the president. The president's name is on your ballot. And that is a separate category of voting from the voting of a Congress member or a senator. And the Senate is elected in the US as well. So in Canada, you will never vote for the Prime Minister. You only vote for the candidate that's running in your riding. But by default, when you vote for that candidate, you are by default voting for that party. So at the end of the election, and now since there's computers, it's done very, very quickly. Probably if there's no big drama, it'll be done within a few hours. And then we'll find out what all of the different parties, the numbers will be tallied. And whoever has the most votes will become the Prime Minister. However, actually, okay, before I say that, they will not become Prime Minister. They will have the votes. The Governor General will then ask the leader of that party to please form government. It's just a technical thing, but just to know that's the process. Okay. The person who is the leader of the party with the most votes will then set up their cabinet. And again, this is distinctive. The British parliamentary system is distinctive from the American system or other systems. The cabinet is all elected MPs. They are not separate. Like in America, people we know as being the cabinet are completely unelected and don't sit in Congress. In Canada, they are all MPs, and they all sit and they're formed from the MPs. So you often you hear the term cabinet minister. That means that in the government, there are separate ministries. One person from the ruling party is given the role of being the minister. All of those people together, all of those women and men together form the cabinet of the elected government. But there are other MPs who are not in the cabinet because there's only a set number of ministers. The majority of those people are not going to be in the cabinet. They are called backbencher MPs. Okay, but all of the MPs from every party that are elected form the respective caucuses of each party. So, and then one of these parties who has the second number of votes is asked by the Governor General to form the official opposition. So the status of the official opposition is a very important position because in the course of government, that is that party is allowed or designated to ask the first questions when bills are passed in question period, or when bills are tabled in question period. So that's a very important thing. And in the history of the British parliamentary system, the official opposition is called Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, which implies a certain understanding of the role of the opposition in politics, which is that to challenge the government, to question the government's bills, to push the government forward is part of the loyal work of the elected MPs and their role of the official opposition. So the party that becomes the official opposition, which is the party with the second number of votes, they form a cabinet as well. It's called the shadow cabinet. The shadow cabinet has designated people who are shadowing
the government ministers. Their task is to follow the actions of that particular ministry and that particular minister, and to challenge all of the things that they do, and to be aware of any mistakes or any harm that they might be doing, and to bring that up in Parliament. Okay, so we talked about in this election there are 338 seats. That means to have a clear majority, and my math might be wrong, so correct me, I believe that would be 179. I just guessed that. Okay, I'm in the arts, not sciences. Okay, so 179. So if one party gets 179 elected MPs in the House of Commons,